So a unique book in its own right, and we'll explain why that's the case when we get into it. Of course, it's one of the, isn't there only two that's named after women? There's Ruth and Esther, the books. But there, of course, are a lot of other women that are crucial to God's plan of bringing Jesus into the world. And Esther, of course, is one of these women who played directly into the preservation of the Jewish nation during a time of persecution and an attempted extermination takes place during the Persian king period. As it says at number 1, Esther was actually the lady who became the queen wife of Xerxes or Ahasuerus, depending on your translation. But he was a Persian king, and from 485 to 465 BC. And so she is in high places, and she's in a place of influence, as we'll see. The story falls chronologically between Ezra, chapter 6 and 7, and we pointed that out last week. So if you had your Bibles open to Ezra 6 and 7, you could put insert Esther here. That is historically how the timeline unfolds. And so that's the chronology of it anyway. But it's not really tied to the stories or the events recorded in Ezra or Nehemiah. It's a separate issue. It's over in a different place. It's over in the palace related to the Jewish nation. It says it records the survival of the Jewish nation in the face of an organized attempt at genocide. That is to say, the eradication of an entire race of people or an entire nation. God preserves his people and eventually brings Messiah into the world through them. That's the whole idea, right? God is still working out his plan. That's always what's in the background of the Old Testament. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, God is going to accomplish his purpose. But he does it amazingly in the book of Esther without to the point of the book is that God works oftentimes, God works providentially behind the scenes. You just see the flow of history. You experience what the world is doing as it's unfolding. But as Christians, we want to remember that there is an intelligence that's guiding human history to a desired end, to a purpose. And he's going to accomplish it, even though it seems like things are becoming more and more filled with anarchy and things. But toward the origin of a special feast called the Feast of Purim, or lots. That is to say, there's a story about the casting of lots in this book, and then because of what happened in these days, a feast was named after the lot that was cast, or the lots, plural, Purim. For example, in chapter 3, verse 7, we read about the casting of the lots by Haman to decide what day, when to start this extermination. It says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year, the month until it fell on the 12th month in the month of Adar. So it's a game of chance. We're going to say, well, let's see when we're going to start this extermination, and they cast the lot. Well, because of how this story turns out, the Jews are going to celebrate their victory over this plot with a feast called the Feast of the Lots. And that's recorded, as I say there, in chapter 9, verse 23 and following. This kind of gives you a summary. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of the Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on its own head. We'll talk about what that means. And that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So this is a capsule summary of saying that whole plot was reversed. The Jews were spared, and the wicked Haman was the one who ended up losing his life. And so they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and in their descendants, and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year. So that's really the whole point of I'll say the whole point, but the book is recording where this feast came from. And then, of course, tradition is that the Jews would read the book during this feast, just to remind the Jews every year about how God protects and saves his people and accomplishes his purposes. In explaining the origin of this feast, the book tells of this evil plot by Haman. We just read it there. He is an Amalekite. He's an Agagite, and Agag was the king of the Amalekites, if you read about that in 1 Samuel. And so he was Jews and the Amalekites. It says there, this story resurfaces an age-old rivalry between the Jews and the Amalekites, beginning really as far back as Exodus, whenever they came out of Egypt and into the wilderness, they had to fight the Amalekites. So you can look at those passages if you wanted to on your own time, but we're not going to go there. Amalek is depicted in Jewish scripture as really somewhat of an epitome of evil force. Of evil. The defeat of Haman and the salvation of the Jewish race, God wins an ultimate victory. This was the end of the Amalekites. Letter C, the drama is captured in this story that centers around a young Jewish girl named Esther, who is chosen as queen to the most powerful king in the world. So this shows again that Esther would be a picture of vulnerability, insignificant, so to speak, and yet God, because God is using her in his providence, she is the most influential person in the world to be one standing in the gap to spare God's people, or to help spare God's people. Okay. What I want to do is read through it somewhat. I hope I can remember which verses I wanted to read, but here's the outline as it says in the middle of your page. And this is the first two chapters, is Esther is chosen as queen in place of the original queen, Vashti. Mordecai saves the king's life. So this is the first two chapters. Now Vashti Vashti was the Persian queen, but she did not heed the king's command, and so he deposed her and needed a replacement. And so, looking for all the beautiful women and all the virgin girls in the whole kingdom, and so he realized the virtue and the beauty and this woman was special, this girl was special. So he chose Esther. In fact, if you looked at verse 17, this is chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. That is to say, all the other virgin young women who were. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. And so he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. He proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So there, Esther, providentially again, see, it doesn't mention the Lord did this or the Lord said this. None of that is included. It's just the flow of history, how everything, with all the free people making their free choices, the king freely choosing who he wanted to choose, and yet, because, and here's the crucial point, because God already knew what the circumstances, he arranged those circumstances to accomplish his purpose. That way, human freedom is preserved as well as God being sovereign over the flow of history. So much more could be said about that, but it's crucial to understanding how all of this even can work. But God, because he knows all of these things, he's omniscient, he can do it. And that's exactly what's taking place here. And so, before chapter 2 is out, you have this little paragraph that is going to be very significant. Verse 19 says, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. By the way, I didn't say this. Mordecai is it her uncle or her cousin? Cousin, I think it's a cousin, yeah. So anyway, but he's an older person in her family who took care of her and raised her essentially. And so he kind of has he's a father figure of sorts. But anyway, that's why you read about this Mordecai. He's the Jewish man, and he loves Esther, and he wants to make sure she's okay and always in her people. That is, that she was Jewish. Just as Mordecai had charged her, because Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, and it mentions Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, they became furious and they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. See, they were going to plot to try to assassinate him. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who then told Queen Esther, and then Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made and were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai saved the king's life. Again, you got to stop and think. Well, it doesn't say God told Mordecai anything. It doesn't say that God sent a prophet to say this or that. It's just Mordecai happened to overhear it. He happened to be in the right place, and he happened to hear a conversation, or somehow he come into knowledge of this. And then he told the queen, and the queen told the king, and the king. All of this just unfolds historically. And yet, the underlying point of the book is God is the sovereign of history. And so that's going to be important. So it's written in the Chronicles in the presence of the king and put in a book. So Mordecai's name is there. But things go on. The next chapter, letter B, is Haman's plot against the Jews because Mordecai refuses to bow. So this whole chapter explains this Haman fella who is, he's rather full of himself. He expects to, but Mordecai would not bow, would not pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gates, said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Of course, Mordecai's not going to bow because he knows that the Amalekites are God's enemies. He only bows to the Lord in these kinds of things. Verse 6, though, explains Haman's anger. As verse 5 says, Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage. He was filled with wrath, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, meaning, I just want to wipe out the whole race. I hate the Jewish race. So there is this animosity. Because who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast the lot before Haman to determine the day. So that's how the plot unfolds. He's going to determine to get all the arms ready so that all the people of the province will surprise the Jews by this day. The sun comes up and all of a sudden the swords come out and they start killing. The Jews will know nothing about it. That's the idea. So that's the plot. Now, letter C. Esther courageously agrees to help the Jews. This is chapter 4. So chapter 4, verse 1 says, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes. Mordecai learns of this plot, and he knows the only hope we have now is for me to get to my cousin, to Esther, the queen, in order to hopefully plead with the king to do something about this. Now, the importance of this, or the important point here, is the rest of chapter 3 explained that whenever Haman got all of this plan and this plot solidified, it was ratified by the king's own seal, okay? And so it was written out, it was planned, the day was set, and the king sealed it. And if you remember this phrase in Daniel, and I might blow it, but it says something like the laws of the Medes and the Persians, a constitutional monarchy, by the way. So in other words, the king, though he is sovereign in the administration, he is subject to the law of the land. So whenever he puts something into law, even he can't reverse it. It sounds strange, but this is just the polity of this particular type of government. A constitutional monarchy. And so he is bound by the law that he put into place. That's the idea. So Mordecai is like, there's no way to reverse that. I don't know what to do. I got to beg Esther to go before the king. And so chapter 4, verses 14 and following is kind of this key conversation. Mordecai says, let's see, start in 13. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do you think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews? If you your father's house will perish. Yet who knows, Esther, whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." That's that key phrase that we often hear in these kinds of sermons, right? See, this is provident. Who knows? You live next door to your neighbor, right? Who knows whether God put you there in order to teach the gospel? So you ought to take advantage of those opportunities that are there because you believe in the providence of God, right? That's what's meant by that. You know, you see a need before you, you see where Christ can be exalted. Who knows whether God has not put you there? You just told them to reply to Mordecai, go, Mordecai, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. If I perish, I perish. So it shows her trust, I guess, in the Lord, and kind of like Daniel's friends, right? Whether God saves us or not, I'm going to do what I should do here, and I'll trust him with the outcome. And so this is what she's doing. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So, of course, this is set. Esther courageously agrees to help the Jews. So letter D is Esther holds a banquet for the king and Haman and uncovers Haman's plot. So she holds a banquet. Here's where I'm not sure exactly where to go to make it smooth, but it may not be very smooth. We'll see. So she holds a banquet in order to, in verse 2, so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and then Esther went near and touched the top of his scepter. So she took a risk in going into the presence without being invited, and the king looked favorably upon her. Again, doesn't say God directly did it, but God knew how he would respond if the circumstances were arranged like this, and so God arranged the circumstances such that the king would look favorably upon Esther freely. And so she did not lose her life, and instead the queen was granted a request, and she wanted to hold this feast. And now, and this is, the next few chapters is how the plot against the Jews is uncovered. Anyway, here's where I saved the king's life, right? By uncovering the plot against the king. It says, chapter 6, verse 1, that night, that is after this banquet that was held, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana there, it's Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king says, wait, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Wasn't he rewarded for this, right? The king's servants who attended him said, well, no, nothing's been done for him. His name was written here, but there was nothing done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest to the king that he should hang Mordecai on the gallows, and that he had prepared for him. So here again, all of these circumstances are coming together in one place. It just seems like the way things happen, just the flow of history. You don't see God directly arranging any of this, again, other than prepared a gallows to hang his enemy Mordecai on. After he feels all exalted because he was honored at this banquet, he's now going to go into the king and say, let me hang Mordecai on these gallows because he dishonored you, disobeyed your law. Well, it just happens to be that night, the king couldn't sleep. And he read about the virtue of Mordecai, and he wants to honor Mordecai. Haman wants to hang him. The king wants to honor him. Well, in the conversation that follows, this is probably one of the most grandest ironies in all of the book. But it says, verse 5, the king's servant said, well, Haman is here, standing in the court. The king said, well, let him come in. Well, Haman came in. Of course, he was going to say, King, let me hang Mordecai. But instead, the king spoke first and said, Haman, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? In other words, what would be bestowing great honor on a man here in the kingdom? And what did Haman think? Haman thought in his heart, well, who in the world would the king want to honor more than me? I'm the one who's worthy of all the honor in the kingdom. So Haman is now going to be thinking of the grandest way to honor a man because he thinks it's going to be for himself. And Haman answered the king and said, well, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which that'll be me, right? Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one who's of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. That would be me. Then parade him on horseback through the city square. That would be me. And proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That would be me. Then the king said to Haman, okay, Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do this for Mordecai. So here again is that irony where it must have hit him like a ton of bricks, right? Because he wanted to hang him, now he's got to honor him. Again, the way God reverses fortune, leave nothing undone of all that I've spoken. Now, Haman has to do this or he's going to be killed by the king because he'd be in direct rebellion against the king. Verse 11, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. He could probably barely get the words out. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. He went back and wept before his wife and explained what all had happened to him there. Chapter 7 is the end of Mordecai, at the end of Haman here. So the king, and on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request up to half the kingdom? It shall be done. Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases my king, and here's her plea, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. She's saying, save my life and save my people's life. Of course, the king is unaware of what she's talking about. But she says, verse 4, we have been sold, annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. In other words, this is grave. Verse 5, so King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, well, who is he? Where is he? Who would dare to presume in his heart to do something like this? And Esther said, it's the adversary is the enemy, this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And you got to remember, it was already set in stone, right? It was already sealed. Even the king can't just say, okay, let's forget that ever happened. But he realizes that Haman had probably expecting to get his head chopped off. But as it happened, of course, we got to read the rest of this chapter, don't we? Verse 7 says, then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, because he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. So the king probably stepped out and thought, oh, I'm thinking about how am I going to kill this guy, right? Or, of course, it might have been grieving because he might have liked Haman, but he knows that Haman had just betrayed his trust. Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was, and the king said, oh, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. It looked like maybe Haman was attacking the queen now, or trying to ravish her or something. But it just all looked bad for him. Now, Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, king, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Irony of ironies, right? Not only did Haman have to honor Mordecai when he wanted to hang him, He actually himself was hung on the very gallows that he had prepared to hang Mordecai on. Chapters 8 and following is the exaltation of Mordecai, of course, because he is the one who saved the king's life, and the king wanted to honor him. And so by God's providence, there is exaltation of Mordecai in the court. Now, Esther asks about revoking the letter. This is chapter 8, verse 3. Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther, and so Esther rose and stood before the king and said, "If it pleases the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and if I'm pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces." So she wants to revoke it, but as it explains here, it can't really be revoked. But here is how they determined to handle the situation. Verse 7, the King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. But you yourselves now write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name. Seal it with the king's signet. No one can revoke." So we're going to counteract the first decree with another. And so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month. By the way, it's my understanding this is the longest verse in the Old Testament. That's going to be the only piece of information you remember from the whole lesson, isn't it? Chapter 8, verse 9 is the longest verse in the Old Testament. And we're going to read it. Let's read it. So the king's scribes were called at that time, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. Here it is. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions, on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves and their enemies. This was going to be a surprise attack. But now you go out and arm all of your people, and they'll know exactly when it's going to happen. They can defend themselves in order to preserve their lives. The couriers rode on royal horses, went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel, and such. Verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor in every province and city wherever the king command and decree came. The Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the 9 records that the Jews did defend themselves, and they actually went on the offensive and destroyed all of the popular phrase today is anti-Semites, right? Those who were against the Jews. And so the chapter 9, verse 1 at the end of the verse says, "On that day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces. Of them fell upon all the people." So that is the story of Esther, essentially. And because of the victory now that God in his providence gave the Jews through all of these events that we read, they instituted the Feast of Purim. And every year they would read this story and praise God because of the victory he gave them. Which, of course, ultimately is just to preserve the nation, to bring Jesus into the world, to be the Savior of mankind. So the application is pretty simple. Let's just focus on the first one because our time is up. Are y'all tired? As tired as I am? God's providence. We've been talking about it the whole time, but that's what this is really about. There's no mention of God in the book. Doesn't even yet. The story clearly implies that he is orchestrator of all the seemingly insignificant coincidences that occur to favor his people. This silence is a literary device of this genre of literature to illustrate the very nature of what we call God's providence. God is not seen directly, but he is clearly working behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes and prosper his people. And so I have other verses there that we sometimes use. When Philemon 15, right? When Paul wrote to Philemon, the slave owner whose slave Onesimus had run away, he said, perhaps as a beloved brother in the Lord. So Onesimus ran away from Philemon, but perhaps in God's providence that turned out for the salvation of Onesimus, for the growth of Philemon himself, who would receive his slave back now as a brother in the Lord, and of course for Paul to be served over in Rome as well. All of those different things. Genesis 50 and verse 2 is where Joseph said to his brothers, you intended good. So even the evil schemes of people in the world, God can use to promote his cause. And then, of course, we read Esther 4:4-6. And we read many of those verses already where we pointed that out in the story. So God also works in our lives. I say this can't be proven empirically, but we believe it because the Bible says that, right? Romans 8:28 could be put here. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. So these are passages that we take comfort in whenever we realize that we live in a world that seems to be a world of uncertainty and a world that seems to have a lot of superfluous suffering. But as Christians, we understand that God is still God, and so we can trust him, even if we have to suffer for his name. Thank you guys so much for your attention, and we will conclude our overview of Esther there and have a final song and a final prayer, and then we'll be dismissed for the rest of the day. Thank you guys so much.